"You're going to fail," Mr. Collins sneered, his words cutting through the silence of the classroom like a blade. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded across his chest, watching Mark carefully. The other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some glancing at each other, others staring down at their notebooks, pretending not to notice the tense exchange. Mark stood frozen, his mind racing. The words hung in the air like an accusation, a challenge he never expected to hear from his teacher. Mr. Collins wasn't just another teacher who handed out grades, he was a man who prided himself on being tough, unyielding, and unapologetically blunt. But there was something about this moment, something in the way Mr. Collins said it, that made Mark's chest tighten. The class was nearing its end, and the bell was about to ring, signaling a temporary escape from the tension. But that seemed insignificant in comparison to the words Mark had just heard. The air felt thick, the walls seemed to close in. "You're just not cut out for this, Mark. You've got no focus, no determination. Look at your grades. They don't lie." Mr. Collins continued, his voice dripping with condescension. Mark clenched his fists at his sides. He'd heard this before, countless times, from classmates, from family, from others. He wasn't the smartest kid in the class, that was true. But he wasn't stupid. No one understood what he had to go through. No one understood what it felt like to be always underestimated, always put down. It was as if his every move was scrutinized, his every mistake amplified just because of who he was. His dark skin, his mannerisms, his background, none of it fit the mold Mr. Collins seemed to think was necessary for success. It wasn't that Mark didn't try, he did. But for some reason, no matter how hard he worked, it never seemed enough. No matter how much effort he put into his assignments, they were never good enough to meet Mr. Collins' standards. There was a moment of silence after Mr. Collins' words. The teacher's eyes narrowed slightly, as though savoring the discomfort in the room. For a second, it felt as though the whole class had vanished, and it was just the two of them, locked in this standoff. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but words caught in his throat. What could he say? How could he even begin to explain everything that had been weighing on him? His entire life, people had looked at him and made assumptions based on his skin color, his accent, his clothes. People who didn't know anything about him, about his struggles, his dreams. The constant fight to prove himself. "You don't have it in you," Mr. Collins said again, his voice softer now, almost triumphant. "I've seen students like you come and go. You'll be just another statistic. Another failure." Something inside Mark snapped. For years, he had taken the abuse, the slights, the judgment, always keeping his head down. Always trying to meet everyone else's expectations. But this? This was different. He wasn't going to let this man, this teacher who didn't even know him, define who he was. He wasn't going to let Mr. Collins' cruel predictions dictate his future. Mark's heart raced, and he suddenly felt a surge of adrenaline flood his body. He was done being the underdog. He was done being the kid everyone thought would fail. If Mr. Collins wanted to bet on his failure, then so be it, but he would prove him wrong. Mark took a deep breath, his voice shaking slightly as he spoke. "You don't know me, Mr. Collins. You have no idea what I'm capable of. I'll show you. I'll show you that I'm not some failure." The teacher's smile faltered for a moment, the faintest hint of uncertainty flashing in his eyes. But then he quickly recovered, leaning forward, his gaze hardening once more. "Prove it," Mr. Collins challenged, his voice dripping with disdain. "Prove me wrong. But don't say I didn't warn you. This isn't a game. You won't get by on wishful thinking." Mark swallowed hard, nodding. The words hung in the air between them like a final ultimatum. There was no turning back now. The bell rang, loud and sharp, breaking the tension in the room. The students scrambled to pack up their things, eager to escape the heavy atmosphere. But Mark didn't move. He stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at Mr. Collins. The teacher gave him a fleeting glance, then turned to the chalkboard, dismissing him entirely. For Mark, the moment felt like a call to arms. Something had ignited within him, something fierce and determined. He wasn't going to let this man, or anyone, dictate his worth. He would prove them all wrong, starting with Mr. Collins. As the other students filed out of the classroom, Mark gathered his books slowly. He felt the weight of every word Mr. Collins had said, the sting of his failure, but more than that, he felt something else, something powerful and unexpected. Hope. Hope that, against all odds, he could turn this around. Walking out of the classroom, Mark's mind raced. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. He had no illusions about that. He wasn't the smartest kid in the class. But he had something else, something the others didn't see. As he made his way to the hallway, Mark found himself wondering how far he was willing to go to prove himself. How far would he push? What lengths would he go to in order to show Mr. Collins, and everyone else, that they were wrong about him? Days turned into weeks, and Mark threw himself into his studies with a newfound intensity. Every assignment, every test, he gave it everything he had. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of the pressure almost crushed him. But he kept going. There were no shortcuts, no easy answers. It was just him, his books, and an overwhelming desire to silence the doubts. Then came the moment of truth, the final exam. Mark sat in the classroom, his heart pounding as he glanced at the paper in front of him. The words blurred in front of his eyes for a moment, but he took a deep breath and steadied himself. This was it. This was his chance to prove it all. He worked through the exam, each question a battle, but he was determined. When he finished, he handed it in with no fanfare, no dramatic gesture. He simply walked out of the room, his mind focused on the next steps, on the challenges that still lay ahead. But deep down, he knew something had changed. Something had shifted inside him. This wasn't just about passing a test anymore. This was about proving to himself that he was more than what others thought of him. The weeks passed. The students anxiously awaited their results, and Mark was no exception. Each day felt like an eternity as he replayed the exam in his mind, wondering if he had done enough to impress Mr. Collins, to prove him wrong. Finally, the results were posted. Mark walked to the bulletin board, his hands shaking as he searched for his name. When he saw it, his heart stopped. His grade? An A. He couldn't believe it. He had done it. He had beaten the odds. And it wasn't just for Mr. Collins. It was for himself. But that wasn't the end of the story. What happened next would shock everyone. The days after the exam passed in a blur. Mark was consumed with his result, the thrill of having defied Mr. Collins' prediction, but also with an undercurrent of doubt. He had earned that A, but was it truly enough to prove himself? Was it just a fluke? Was it enough to silence the whispers that always followed him? The weight of his grade sat uneasily in his chest. It wasn't just about the test or about winning the argument with Mr. Collins. No, this had become something much bigger. It was about proving to himself that he wasn't defined by the assumptions others made of him. It was about showing the world he was more than what people saw at first glance. But as time passed, Mark found that not everyone shared in his success. While some of his classmates congratulated him, those who were genuinely happy for him, those who didn't have the same biases as Mr. Collins, others were less thrilled. It wasn't obvious, but it was there. The quiet judgments, the way people's eyes lingered a moment too long, as though they were trying to figure out if his success was earned or if it was just a one-time miracle. And then there was Mr. Collins. The day after the results were posted, Mark stood before the classroom door, the small slip of paper with his grade still clutched tightly in his hand. He hesitated for a moment, the reality of the situation sinking in. Was he ready to confront Mr. Collins again? After everything that had happened? He pushed the door open, the familiar hum of chatter from the students greeting him as he entered. The classroom fell silent when Mr. Collins looked up and saw him standing there. The teacher's eyes flickered with something: disappointment? Surprise? It was hard to tell. "Mark," Mr. Collins said, his voice colder than usual, "I see you've received your grade." His gaze narrowed. "How did you manage that?" Mark took a deep breath. He knew this conversation was inevitable. But instead of shrinking back, as he might have in the past, he stood tall. "I earned it," he said simply, his voice steady, unyielding. "I didn't just get lucky." Mr. Collins didn't respond immediately. He stared at Mark for a long moment, his gaze hard, almost as if he was measuring him. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, he turned back to his desk, waving a dismissive hand. "We'll see, won't we?" he muttered. That was it. The words hung in the air like an unspoken challenge, one Mark knew he had to face. But something in the way Mr. Collins dismissed him, so coldly, so casually, struck a nerve in Mark. It wasn't just the teacher's rejection, it was the realization that for all the work he had put in, for all the effort he had poured into his success, people would always find a way to undermine it. He could never truly win. But then again, maybe that was the point. Maybe the real victory wasn't about the grade or the recognition. It was about how he saw himself, and how he would continue to challenge himself, no matter what anyone else thought. The days following that encounter with Mr. Collins were filled with uncertainty. Mark had proven himself once, but the battle wasn't over. There were whispers in the halls, lingering stares from teachers and students alike. Some had started to view him differently, but others were still skeptical. They didn't believe he could maintain it. They didn't believe someone like him had the potential to rise above his circumstances. It was exhausting, trying to constantly prove himself to everyone else. But Mark pushed through. Every day, he focused on his work, on his personal growth. He refused to let the doubts seep in. Then came the phone call. It was a Wednesday afternoon, just as Mark was settling in to study for another round of exams. The call came through from an unknown number, but for some reason, he felt an uneasy tug in his gut. Something told him it was important. "Hello?" Mark answered, his voice guarded. "Mark? It's Ms. Henderson. From the school's counseling office." Mark's heart skipped a beat. Ms. Henderson had been his guidance counselor since freshman year, and while they had a decent relationship, they didn't often communicate outside of scheduled meetings. "Yes, Ms. Henderson, what's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his tone even. "I need you to come down to my office as soon as you can. It's about something urgent." "Urgent? Is everything okay?" Mark asked, his curiosity piqued. "I can't go into details over the phone, but it's important. Please come down. It's about the exam results." His pulse quickened. The exam results? Was it about his grade? Was there a problem? He had no idea what to expect, but something in Ms. Henderson's voice told him it wasn't just a routine matter. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Mark said, hanging up before she could respond. He grabbed his jacket and rushed out the door, his mind swirling with questions. Why would Ms. Henderson need to speak to him about his exam results? Had something gone wrong? When he arrived at the counseling office, Ms. Henderson was waiting for him. She looked unusually serious, which only heightened Mark's unease. "Sit down, Mark," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Mark sat down, trying to read her expression. "What's going on? Is everything okay?" Ms. Henderson hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Mark, I need to be honest with you. I've been looking into your grades, specifically from Mr. Collins' class. There's something strange going on." Mark's heart sank. "Strange how?" She took a deep breath, her gaze shifting uneasily. "I've noticed discrepancies in the grading system. It seems like your exam paper was graded unfairly." What do you mean, unfairly? Mark's mind raced. Are you saying I didn't earn my grade? No, it's not that. It's more complicated than that, Miss Henderson explained. Your paper was graded far more harshly than it should have been. And it wasn't just you. A few other students have come to me with similar concerns. It appears that Mr. Collins might have deliberately skewed their results. Mark stared at her, his breath catching. Are you saying he purposely gave me a bad grade? But I got an A. Ms. Henderson nodded. Exactly. But the grade doesn't matter in this case. What matters is why he did it. It's possible that your success triggered something in him, a sense of rivalry. And he might have retaliated in subtle ways, ways that weren't immediately obvious. Mark's mind was spinning. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He thought he had won, that he had proven himself. But now, it seemed like everything was up in the air. Was his success just a setup for something darker? What are we going to do? Mark asked, his voice tight with frustration. I'm going to investigate this further, Ms. Henderson said. But I need you to stay calm. We have to be careful how we approach this. It's a delicate situation. Mark nodded, his thoughts racing. This was more than he ever expected. He had thought that his struggle with Mr. Collins was over, but it seemed like he had only scratched the surface. There was a larger mystery at play, and it was going to take everything he had to uncover the truth. The rest of the week was a blur. Mark stayed focused on his studies, but his mind kept returning to what Ms. Henderson had told him. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let this go. The fight to prove himself, to survive in a world that constantly tried to hold him back, had only just begun. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something much bigger than he could comprehend. Every conversation he had with Ms. Henderson seemed to deepen the mystery surrounding Mr. Collins. And despite the weight of everything hanging over him, Mark could sense that he was getting closer to something crucial, something that could change everything. For the next few days, his mind was consumed by questions. Why would Mr. Collins target him in this way? Was there something personal going on, something deeper that he wasn't aware of? And what exactly was Ms. Henderson going to do about it? She had been talking about investigation, but Mark wasn't sure what that would entail. All he knew was that the last thing he wanted was to be caught up in some complicated school scandal. He had fought too hard to get where he was, and now it felt like that victory was slipping through his fingers. His stomach churned as he sat at his desk, staring at his open textbooks but unable to focus. The words on the page seemed to blur, and the ticking of the clock on the wall felt like an ominous drumbeat. The knock on his door broke his concentration. It was a brief, almost hesitant knock, but it was enough to pull him out of his thoughts. "Come in," Mark called, straightening up in his chair. The door creaked open, and in stepped Ms. Henderson. She looked more serious than ever, her brow furrowed as though she was carrying a heavy burden. "Mark," she said softly, closing the door behind her. "I need to talk to you." Mark stood up immediately, his pulse quickening. "What's going on? What have you found?" Ms. Henderson glanced around the room as though checking for eavesdroppers, even though they were alone. Then she sat down across from him, her eyes scanning his face before speaking again. "I've done some digging, Mark," she said, her voice low. "And I think I've uncovered something important. But it's not going to be easy for you to hear." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. His gut twisted with dread, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had come this far, he couldn't back down now. "Just tell me. Whatever it is, I can handle it," he replied, though his words didn't quite match the uncertainty gnawing at him. Ms. Henderson took a deep breath, then opened the folder in front of her. She slid a piece of paper across the desk to him. "Here," she said. "This is a copy of your graded exam. But it's not just your grade that's important. It's the comments Mr. Collins left on the paper." Mark picked up the paper, his hands trembling slightly. He unfolded it carefully, scanning over his answers first. His A stood out in bright red ink at the top of the page, but it was the comments that grabbed his attention. They were different, Ms. Henderson continued, watching him carefully. They were harsh, even cruel at times. I've looked through several other students' papers from Mr. Collins' class, and none of them received anything close to this level of criticism. It's personal. Mark's eyes widened as he read the comments again, disappointing. Could do better. Not enough effort. You're capable of more, but you're wasting your potential. A shame. None of it made sense. These were words meant to cut deep, to make him doubt himself, to make him feel small. He had expected criticism, but not this level of bitterness. It was as though Mr. Collins had gone out of his way to belittle him, to undermine any progress he had made. What do you mean by personal? Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ms. Henderson leaned forward. I looked into Mr. Collins' previous students. It seems like there's a pattern, Mark. The students who do well in his class, the ones who challenge him or defy his expectations, he grades them harshly. He takes it personally. And there's more. Some of the students I've spoken to mentioned that he resented certain students for their success. It's like he views it as a direct challenge to his authority. Mark sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. This was worse than he had imagined. Mr. Collins wasn't just a tough teacher, he was someone who used his power to manipulate, to hurt those who dared to outshine him. So, you think he intentionally gave me a bad grade? Mark asked, the question hanging in the air. Ms. Henderson nodded grimly. I do. But the truth is, Mark, it's not just about the grade. It's about the way he operates. There's a pattern here, and I don't think it's an accident. I'm starting to believe that he's deliberately targeting students who make him feel threatened. Mark's chest tightened. This wasn't just about a bad teacher, it was about power, manipulation, and control. Mr. Collins wasn't just trying to hold him back academically, he was trying to crush his spirit, to make him doubt his abilities, to make him feel like he didn't belong. But why me? Mark asked, his voice shaking slightly. Why single me out? I didn't do anything to him. That's the thing, Ms. Henderson said, her voice low. You didn't have to do anything. Sometimes, people like Mr. Collins can't stand it when someone like you, someone with a different background, a different perspective, outshines them. You represent everything he isn't. And that's a threat. Mark swallowed hard. He had known that he was different from the other students in Mr. Collins' class. His background, his upbringing, everything about him stood in contrast to the expectations of the school. But he had never thought that would be used against him. He had just wanted to prove himself, to show that he was capable of success, that he wasn't what others thought of him. But now, it seemed like his every effort was being twisted into a weapon against him. So, what do we do now? Mark asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Ms. Henderson hesitated, then said. I've spoken with a few trusted colleagues. We've decided to report Mr. Collins. But I need you to be ready for this, Mark. It's going to be difficult. People like him don't go down quietly. He'll try to discredit you, to turn the tables. Are you prepared for that? Mark nodded, his resolve hardening. I'm ready. I won't let him get away with this. Not after everything he's done. Ms. Henderson's eyes softened with approval. I knew you'd say that. But you need to understand, this won't be easy. There's a lot at stake here. Not just for you, but for the other students who might be suffering in silence. Mark's mind raced. This wasn't just about his own fight anymore, it was about something much bigger. It was about standing up to the injustice that had been happening for years, to a teacher who had been abusing his position of power for far too long. I understand, Mark said, his voice firm. Let's do it. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, conversations, and paperwork. Ms. Henderson had pulled a small team of trusted staff together to help investigate Mr. Collins' actions. Mark had to speak with a series of administrators, and even some of his classmates who had been directly impacted by Mr. Collins' behavior. Each conversation left Mark feeling more and more certain that he was doing the right thing, but it also wore on him. The emotional toll of confronting the reality of what had been happening in the classroom was immense. But then came the day when everything changed. One afternoon, as Mark sat in the counseling office waiting for an update, he saw something that would change the course of the investigation forever. A familiar face walked through the door. It was one of Mr. Collins' former students, someone Mark had never met before but who had come to speak with Ms. Henderson about what had been happening in Mr. Collins' class. This student had a story of their own to tell, one that would bring Mark one step closer to understanding the full extent of Mr. Collins' actions. And with this new revelation, the fight to expose Mr. Collins had just taken a dramatic turn. Mark had no idea what he was getting himself into when he had first walked into Ms. Henderson's office. The weight of the truth was heavy, and with each new revelation, it seemed as though the walls of his world were slowly crumbling around him. The moment he had decided to take a stand, to expose Mr. Collins for what he had been doing, it had felt like the right thing to do. But now, in the midst of the investigation, Mark realized how much he had underestimated just how deeply ingrained Mr. Collins' actions were in the school's fabric. Days passed, and every conversation Mark had seemed to bring more confusion and frustration. As more students came forward with their own stories, it became clear that Mr. Collins' behavior wasn't just a one-time thing. He had systematically belittled and undermined students who dared to challenge him, students who stood out in any way, whether through their grades, their backgrounds, or their personalities. He had been manipulating the system for years, and no one had dared to speak out against him until now. Mark sat in Ms. Henderson's office, his legs bouncing with nervous energy as he waited for the meeting to begin. The documents laid out in front of him told a chilling story, but Mark still felt like there was a piece of the puzzle missing. "Mark," Ms. Henderson said, walking into the room and closing the door behind her. "We've gathered more information. You've done a good job bringing things to light, but now it's time for the next step. It's time to confront Mr. Collins." Mark looked up at her, his heart pounding in his chest. The thought of facing Mr. Collins directly sent a shiver through his spine. The teacher had always been cold and unyielding, but now, knowing what Mark knew about him, the idea of confronting him seemed almost impossible. "You're sure we're ready for this?" Mark asked, his voice tight. "I don't want to make things worse for anyone else." Ms. Henderson smiled softly. "Mark, you've already done the hard part. You've faced the truth, and now it's time to make sure Mr. Collins does too. But this isn't just about him, it's about giving the other students the voice they never had. You've already proven that you're capable of handling this." Mark nodded, though the knot in his stomach didn't loosen. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't back down now. The meeting with Mr. Collins was set for the following morning, and as Mark walked to the school, he felt like he was walking into battle. He wasn't afraid of what Mr. Collins might say anymore. He had already made it clear that the teacher didn't hold any power over him. But what Mark didn't know was just how deeply Mr. Collins had woven his web of control, or how far he was willing to go to protect his reputation. Ms. Henderson was already at the school when Mark arrived, and together, they walked to Mr. Collins' classroom. The door was slightly ajar, and from inside, they could hear the murmur of voices. Mark hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. "Mark," Ms. Henderson said, her voice low. "Remember, no matter what happens in there, you're doing the right thing. We have the facts, we have the support. Don't let him intimidate you." Mark nodded, taking a deep breath as they stepped into the classroom. Mr. Collins was seated at his desk, his back turned as he jotted something down on a piece of paper. When he heard the door open, he looked up with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ah, Miss Henderson, Mark," he said smoothly, his voice cold as always. What brings you both here this fine morning? We need to talk, Ms. Henderson said, her tone firm. About your behavior towards Mark and several other students. The smile on Mr. Collins' face faltered, just for a moment, but it quickly returned. I'm not sure what you're implying, Ms. Henderson. My behavior is always above reproach. Mark stepped forward then, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. It's not just about me, Mr. Collins. You've been targeting students for years, grading them unfairly, making them feel less than they are. And I'm not the only one who's noticed. You've used your position to undermine us, to make us doubt ourselves. Mr. Collins raised an eyebrow, his gaze hardening as he leaned back in his chair. Is this how you repay me for helping you? I've pushed you, Mark, because I see potential in you. Don't mistake my criticism for something personal. Ms. Henderson spoke up then. We've spoken to several of your former students. They've come forward with their own accounts of being unfairly graded, of being humiliated in front of their peers. This isn't just a one-time issue, Mr. Collins. It's a pattern of behavior that you've been hiding behind for too long. The teacher's eyes narrowed. Are you accusing me of something, Ms. Henderson? This is an outrageous claim. I have always been professional in my dealings with students. If Mark has a problem with his grade, it's his own doing. Mark's hands curled into fists at his sides. You told me I would fail, Mr. Collins. You told me I wasn't capable. But I proved you wrong. I earned that A, not just because I'm lucky, but because I worked harder than anyone in that class. And yet, you still tried to tear me down. Why? The silence in the room was thick. Mr. Collins' expression remained unreadable, but Mark could see the subtle shift in his posture. He wasn't the confident, dismissive teacher Mark had once known. There was something darker lurking beneath the surface. Mark, you don't understand, Mr. Collins finally said, his voice low. You never will. It's not about you. It's about everyone else. You think you've beaten me, but you haven't. There are forces at play here that you're not even aware of. You think this is just about grades, about the classroom? It's bigger than that. You're just a pawn. Mark's stomach twisted. The words didn't make sense, and yet, there was something about the way Mr. Collins said them that unsettled him deeply. A pawn? Mark repeated, his voice shaky. What are you talking about? Mr. Collins stood up from his desk, his eyes flashing with a cold intensity. You think I've been playing this game alone? You've only scratched the surface, Mark. I've been doing this for a long time. I've been in control of this school for years, pulling strings, manipulating the system to maintain order. And you've just tipped the balance. Ms. Henderson's voice cut through the tension. That's enough, Mr. Collins. We're reporting you to the administration, and this investigation is going forward. You won't be able to hide behind your authority anymore. For a moment, Mark thought Mr. Collins might lash out. His hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight with fury. But then, just as suddenly, the anger seemed to drain from him. He straightened, his posture returning to its usual rigid form. You'll regret this, Mr. Collins said, his voice barely above a whisper. All of you will. Mark could feel the weight of those words pressing down on him. There was something about Mr. Collins' demeanor, something in the way he spoke, that made it clear this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As Ms. Henderson turned to leave, Mark lingered for a moment longer, staring at Mr. Collins. The man had been so much more than just a teacher to him. He had been an adversary, a symbol of everything that had held Mark back. But now, it seemed like the game was changing. Mark had stepped into a world of power and manipulation, one that he didn't fully understand, but one that he had no choice but to confront. I'm not afraid of you anymore, Mark said, his voice firm, his resolve unwavering. Mr. Collins' lips twisted into a grim smile. You should be. The days that followed the confrontation with Mr. Collins were tense, filled with whispers, accusations, and mounting pressure. Mark had thought that once he confronted the teacher, things would somehow be clearer. But the truth was, the fight had only just begun. It wasn't just about Mr. Collins anymore, it was about everything he represented, the toxic system that had allowed him to thrive unchecked for years. Every step Mark took toward exposing the truth seemed to open up a new layer of complexity. The battle was no longer just about grades or fairness, it was about dismantling a structure that had long been rooted in power and control. As he pushed forward, Mark found himself facing not only Mr. Collins but the entrenched systems and people that had, for years, supported him. The days grew longer, the nights filled with restless thoughts and haunting dreams of what could happen next. Mark spent his time researching more, meeting with other students who had been affected by Mr. Collins' behavior, and working with Ms. Henderson. Despite the mounting pressure, he found himself growing stronger, more determined. But he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something more sinister was at play. It wasn't just about a teacher's manipulation, it was something deeper. It was late in the evening when Mark got the text message that would change everything. He had been sitting at his desk, staring at a blank page, trying to piece together the final report he and Ms. Henderson had been working on. But the words weren't coming. His mind kept drifting to the meeting with Mr. Collins, to the cryptic warnings the teacher had given him. The forces at play, the suggestion that Mark was just a pawn in a much bigger game, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle he wasn't sure he was ready to solve. Then his phone buzzed. It was from an unknown number, which immediately sent a chill down Mark's spine. Hesitantly, he opened the message. "Meet me tomorrow at 7 p.m. The truth you're looking for is closer than you think. Someone who knows." Mark's heart skipped a beat. The message was vague, but the words, "the truth," echoed in his mind. He had no idea who this message was from, but there was something about it that made his blood run cold. He felt the urge to ignore it, to walk away from whatever this person was offering. But curiosity gnawed at him, and deep down, he knew he couldn't turn back now. He quickly typed a reply, asking who it was, but the message was left unread. Mark set his phone down and rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. It wasn't just the stress of dealing with Mr. Collins anymore. There were forces working against him, pulling him in different directions. The deeper he dug, the more unsettling everything became. He had to find out what this message meant. The next evening, Mark arrived at the location specified in the text message, a small, dimly lit coffee shop near the edge of town. The streets were quieter than usual, and there was an eerie calm in the air, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Mark stood in front of the shop for a moment, unsure of what he was about to walk into. His mind raced with questions: who could be contacting him, and what did they know? Was this a trap set by Mr. Collins or someone who was truly trying to help him? He pushed the door open and stepped inside, immediately greeted by the warmth of the coffee shop and the low hum of conversation. Mark scanned the room, but there was no one waiting for him at the tables. He took a seat in the corner, hoping he hadn't been too early, and tried to calm his nerves. Minutes passed, and then he saw him, an older man, dressed in a gray coat and hat, walking in with a purposeful stride. His face was partially hidden beneath the shadow of his hat, but there was something familiar about him. Mark stood up, his heart racing as the man approached. "You Mark?" the man asked, his voice gruff and deep. "Yes," Mark replied, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. "Are you the one who sent me the message?" The man nodded, taking a seat across from Mark without waiting for an invitation. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I've been watching you, Mark. Watching what you're trying to do with Mr. Collins. But you need to understand, you don't know what you're dealing with." Mark's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? Who are you?" The man hesitated for a moment, then leaned back in his chair, his eyes darting around the coffee shop as though checking for eavesdroppers. "You've uncovered something big. But it's bigger than just Collins. He's a small part of a much larger operation. You're fighting against a network of people who've been using their positions of power to control things for years. And Mr. Collins? He's one of their pawns. Mark's mind spun. He had suspected something bigger was at play, but hearing it confirmed left him shaken. What kind of network? Who else is involved? The man paused, then gave a slight shrug. I can't tell you everything, not yet. But I can tell you this, the people you're dealing with have influence, Mark. They've been protecting Collins because he serves their purposes. The system you're trying to expose? It's built on decades of corruption, of manipulation, and fear. Mark leaned in, his voice tight. So, what do I do now? How do I stop it? The man's eyes softened for a moment, then hardened again. You don't stop it by taking down one teacher. That's a start, sure. But there's much more you need to understand. You need to find the roots of the system, the people who run it. And to do that, you're going to have to go deeper. It's dangerous, Mark. And once you get involved, there's no turning back. Mark swallowed hard. I'm already in it, aren't I? The man's lips curled into a faint smile. You're in it, all right. And there's no way out unless you expose the entire thing. The conversation left Mark with more questions than answers. He had been hoping for a clear path forward, some kind of guidance, but instead, he had just learned how deep the rabbit hole really went. The next day, he met with Ms. Henderson, his mind still reeling from the encounter at the coffee shop. He couldn't tell her everything, he wasn't sure who to trust anymore, but he knew that the stakes had just gotten much higher. We need to prepare for the worst, Ms. Henderson said, looking at him with concern. I know we've been gathering evidence, but Mark. What if it's not enough? What if Collins isn't the real problem? Mark nodded, the weight of the situation sinking in. I think you're right. It's not just about him. There's something bigger going on, something that goes all the way to the top. Ms. Henderson looked at him for a long moment, her expression serious. We can't fight this alone. If there are more people involved, more powerful people, we need help. The next few days were a blur of planning, research, and intense meetings. Mark felt as though he was being pulled in 1,000 different directions. He had never imagined that his desire to expose the wrongs done to him and his peers would lead to something so monumental. Every lead they followed seemed to take them deeper into the labyrinth of deception, and with every discovery, the danger grew. Mr. Collins, it seemed, was merely a small piece of the puzzle. As Mark uncovered more about the network of people that had supported him, the truth began to emerge, not just about Mr. Collins, but about a system that had been built on control, manipulation, and fear. And the deeper Mark dug, the more dangerous the game became. He wasn't just fighting for his future anymore. He was fighting for something much bigger. And the stakes had never been higher. The days after Mark's conversation with the mysterious man in the coffee shop were a blur. As the tension mounted, so did his anxiety. He had been warned that the people he was up against were far more powerful than he had ever imagined, and now the stakes felt higher than ever. The fear that had been simmering in the back of his mind began to creep into his thoughts. There was no turning back now, he had crossed the point of no return. Ms. Henderson had been right. This wasn't just about Mr. Collins. It wasn't about one teacher's abuse of power. It was about something much deeper, something systemic. Mark had uncovered a world of corruption, manipulation, and control, a world that was far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. Mark felt a deep responsibility to finish what he had started, but with each step, the danger grew. It was clear that the people behind the system were watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake, to slip up. And Mark had already made a few mistakes, small ones, unnoticed by most, but enough for him to feel the pressure mounting with every passing day. It was late one evening when Mark received another cryptic message. He had been at home, alone, researching, when his phone buzzed. Come to the old gymnasium tomorrow. 9 p.m. Bring everything you have. Someone who knows. The message was as vague and ominous as the last, but Mark knew this was it. This was the moment he had been dreading, the moment when everything would finally come to a head. Whoever this was, they held the key to unlocking everything. He didn't hesitate. He had to go. He had to face whatever waited for him in that dark gymnasium. The old gymnasium was a relic of the past, a place that hadn't been used for years. The building stood at the far end of the school campus, far from the main halls, shrouded in shadows. As Mark walked toward it, the silence around him seemed unnaturally thick. The wind rustled the trees, but there were no sounds of life here. Just the echo of his own footsteps on the cracked pavement. As he neared the gym, the door creaked open slowly, almost as if beckoning him inside. Mark's heart raced, and he took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He knew this was the moment when everything would change, whether for better or for worse. Inside, the gym was dark, the only light coming from a single, flickering overhead bulb. The air was thick with dust, and the echoes of past events seemed to linger in the silence. The bleachers, long since abandoned, were covered in layers of grime. The basketball court was faded, the lines barely visible. It was a place frozen in time. "Mark," a voice called from the shadows. He turned quickly, his breath catching in his throat. A figure emerged from the darkness, a man in a long coat, his face partially obscured by the low light. Mark's heart skipped a beat as the man stepped into view. "Who are you?" Mark asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked closer, his eyes scanning Mark's face with an intensity that made Mark uneasy. Finally, the man spoke. "I'm someone who knows the truth about everything that's been going on here. Someone who's been watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to step in. And now, it seems that moment has arrived." Mark's pulse quickened. "What truth? What are you talking about?" The man smiled grimly, his eyes dark and knowing. "You've been digging around, Mark. You've been uncovering things that shouldn't be uncovered. And now, you're too close to the truth for your own good." Mark's mind raced. "What truth? Who are you? Why are you helping me?" The man chuckled, a low, almost mocking sound. "I'm not helping you, Mark. I'm just here to deliver a message. You've been playing a dangerous game, but you don't understand what's really at stake. The people you're up against, they have more power than you realize. More power than you'll ever be able to fight on your own." Mark's chest tightened. He had already suspected that there was more to this than he had initially realized, but hearing it confirmed was like a punch to the gut. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice trembling. The man's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "I want you to understand that this fight is bigger than you. This isn't just about Mr. Collins, or even the school. It's about a network that's been controlling things for years. You've exposed one of their pawns, but the truth is, you're just scratching the surface." Mark's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I'm not backing down. I'm going to expose everything. You can't stop me." The man's expression softened, almost pitying. "You think you have a choice? You think you can win this fight? There are forces at play here that you can't even begin to comprehend. Your efforts are meaningless." Mark's stomach churned. He knew he wasn't getting the full story, but it was clear this was his last chance to get to the heart of the conspiracy. "I won't stop," he repeated, his voice steadier now. "You can threaten me all you want, but I'm not backing down." For a moment, the man said nothing, just stared at Mark. Then, with a sigh, he spoke again, his voice lower this time. "You should have stayed out of this, Mark. You should have walked away when you had the chance. But now, you're in too deep. And you're going to pay the price for your curiosity." The tension in the room escalated, and Mark's heart pounded in his chest as the man turned and began to walk away, vanishing into the shadows of the gymnasium. But before Mark could react, the man's voice echoed from the darkness. "Remember, Mark, there's always a cost to seeking the truth. Always." The words lingered in the air long after the man had disappeared. Mark stood frozen in place, his mind reeling. The truth was out there, but so was the danger. And now, it seemed that the people who controlled the truth would stop at nothing to keep it hidden. Mark's instincts told him to leave, but he couldn't. Not yet. He wasn't sure if it was his curiosity, or his refusal to be intimidated, but he had come this far, and he couldn't turn back now. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and last-minute preparations. The information Mark had uncovered was too important to sit on. With Ms. Henderson's help, he compiled everything, every document, every interview, every piece of evidence, and put it all together in a report. He knew that if he was going to take down Mr. Collins and the people behind him, he needed to act fast. But the clock was ticking. The administration had already begun to cover their tracks. Key people who had been part of the network were slowly being moved out of their positions, and rumors began to spread about the unsubstantiated claims being made against Mr. Collins. The pressure was mounting, and Mark could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him. Then, one final meeting was called. Mark, Ms. Henderson, and a handful of trusted colleagues gathered in a small conference room late one afternoon. The air was thick with anticipation. "We have everything we need," Ms. Henderson said, looking over the documents. "It's time to present the evidence to the board." Mark nodded, but the tension in his chest wouldn't ease. He had already seen what happened when people like Mr. Collins were exposed. People with power didn't go down easily. They had the connections, the resources, the influence. But this time, Mark wasn't going to let them win. The meeting with the school board was a tense, dramatic moment. As Mark and Ms. Henderson laid out the evidence, the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It didn't take long for the realization to hit them: the truth was undeniable. Mr. Collins' behavior had been systematically manipulative. The network of influence he was a part of was vast and deep. But now, there was no turning back. In the end, the truth was revealed. Mark's relentless pursuit of justice, despite the odds, had uncovered a web of corruption that went far beyond Mr. Collins. The board took swift action, removing the teacher from his position and investigating those who had been complicit in covering up the truth. But even with the victory, Mark knew this was only one battle in a much larger war. The system he had uncovered was deeply entrenched, and there would always be more battles to fight. But now, Mark had a new understanding. It wasn't just about fighting the system, it was about exposing it for what it was, piece by piece, and never backing down. The final confrontation had taken everything out of him, his courage, his resolve, but it had also given him something greater, the knowledge that, in the end, truth had its own power.